I had arrived in the city of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, on my way to the mountains to look for Don Juan. On my way out of town early in the morning, I had the good sense to drive by the main square, and there I found him, sitting on his favorite bench, as if waiting for me to go by. I joined him. He told me that he was in the city on business, and that he was staying at a local boarding house, and that I was welcome to stay with him because he had to remain in town for 2 more days. We talked for a while about my activities and problems in the academic world. As was customary with him, he suddenly hit me on my back when I least expected it, and the blow shifted me into a state of heightened awareness. We sat in silence for a very long time. I anxiously waited for him to begin talking, yet when he did, he caught me by surprise. "Ages before the Spaniards came to Mexico," he said, "there were extraordinary Toltec seers, men capable of inconceivable deeds. They were the last link in a chain of knowledge that extended over thousands of years. The Toltec seers were extraordinary men, powerful sorcerers, somber, driven men who unraveled mysteries and possessed secret knowledge that they used to influence and victimize people by fixating the awareness of their victims on whatever they chose." He stopped talking and looked at me intently. I felt that he was waiting for me to ask a question, but I did not know what to ask. "I have to emphasize an important fact," he continued. "The fact that those sorcerers knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims. You didn't pick up on that. When I mentioned it, it didn't mean anything to you. That's not surprising. One of the hardest things to acknowledge is that awareness can be manipulated." I felt confused. I knew that he was leading me towards something. I felt a familiar apprehension, the same feeling I had whenever he began a new round of his teachings. I told him how I felt. He smiled vaguely. Usually when he smiled, he exuded happiness. This time he was definitely preoccupied. He seemed to consider for a moment whether or not to go on talking. He stared at me intently again, slowly moving his gaze over the entire length of my body. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded and said that I was ready for my final exercise, something that all warriors go through before considering themselves fit to be on their own. I was more mystified than ever. "We are going to be talking about awareness," he continued. "The Toltec seers knew the art of handling awareness. As a matter of fact, they were the supreme masters of that art. When I say that they knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims, I mean that their secret knowledge and secret practices allowed them to pry open the mystery of being aware. Enough of their practices have survived to this day, but fortunately in a modified form. I say fortunately because those activities, as I will explain, did not lead the ancient Toltec seers to freedom, but to their doom." "Do you know those practices yourself?" I asked. "Why, certainly," he replied. "There is no way for us not to know those techniques, but that doesn't mean that we practice them ourselves. We have other views. We belong to a new cycle." "But you don't consider yourself a sorcerer, Don Juan? Do you?" I asked. "No, I don't," he said. "I am a warrior who sees. In fact, all of us are los nuevos videntes, the new seers. The old seers were the sorcerers. For the average man," he continued, "sorcery is a negative business, but it is fascinating all the same. That's why I encouraged you in your normal awareness to think of us as sorcerers. It's advisable to do so. It serves to attract interest. But for us to be sorcerers would be like entering a dead-end street." I wanted to know what he meant by that, but he refused to talk about it. He said that he would elaborate on the subject as he proceeded with his explanation of awareness. I asked him then about the origin of the Toltec's knowledge. The way the Toltecs first started on the path of knowledge was by eating power plants, he replied. Whether prompted by curiosity, or hunger, or error, they ate them. Once the power plants had produced their effects on them, it was only a matter of time before some of them began to analyze their experiences. In my opinion, the first men on the path of knowledge were very daring, but very mistaken. Isn't all of this a conjecture on your part, Don Juan? No, this is no conjecture of mine. I am a seer, and when I focus my seeing on that time, I know everything that took place. Can you see the details of things of the past? I asked. Seeing is a peculiar feeling of knowing, he replied. Of knowing something without a shadow of doubt. In this case, I know what those men did, not only because of my seeing, but because we are so closely bound together. Don Juan explained then that his use of the term Toltec did not correspond to what I understood it to mean. To me, it meant a culture, the Toltec Empire. To him, the term Toltec meant man of knowledge. He said that in the time he was referring to, centuries or perhaps even millennia before the Spanish conquest, all such men of knowledge lived within a vast geographical area, north and south of the Valley of Mexico, and were employed in specific lines of work: curing, bewitching, storytelling, dancing, being an oracle, preparing food and drink. Those lines of work fostered specific wisdom that distinguished them from average men. These Toltecs, moreover, were also people who fitted into the structure of everyday life, very much as doctors, artists, teachers, priests, and merchants in our own time do. They practiced their professions under the strict control of organized brotherhoods, and became proficient and influential to such an extent that they even dominated groups of people who lived outside the Toltecs' geographical regions. Don Juan said that after some of these men had finally learned to see, after centuries of dealing with power plants, the most enterprising of them then began to teach other men of knowledge how to see. And that was the beginning of their end. As time passed, the number of seers increased, but their obsession with what they saw, which filled them with reverence and fear, became so intense that they ceased to be men of knowledge. They became extraordinarily proficient in the seeing, and could exert great control over the strange worlds they were witnessing. But it was to no avail. Seeing had undermined their strength and forced them to be obsessed with what they saw. There were seers, however, who escaped that fate, Don Juan continued. Great men who, in spite of their seeing, never ceased to be men of knowledge. Some of them endeavored to use seeing positively and to teach it to their fellow men. I'm convinced that under their direction, the populations of entire cities went into other worlds and never came back. But the seers who could only see were fiascos, and when the land where they lived was invaded by a conquering people, they were as defenseless as everyone else. Those conquerors, he went on, took over the Toltec world. They appropriated everything, but they never learned to see. Why do you think they never learned to see? I asked. Because they copied the procedures of the Toltec seers without having the Toltec's inner knowledge. To this day, there are scores of sorcerers all over Mexico, descendants of those conquerors, who follow the Toltec ways but don't know what they're doing, or what they're talking about, because they're not seers. Who were those conquerors, Don Juan? Other Indians, he said. When the Spaniards came, the old seers had been gone for centuries. But there was a new breed of seers who were starting to secure their place in a new cycle. What do you mean, a new breed of seers? After the world of the first Toltecs was destroyed, the surviving seers retreated and began a serious examination of their practices. The first thing they did was to establish stalking, dreaming, and intent as the key procedures to de-emphasize the use of power plants. Perhaps that gives us a hint as to what really happened to them with power plants. The new cycle was just beginning to take hold when the Spanish conquerors swept the land. Fortunately, by that time, the new seers were thoroughly prepared to face that danger. They were already consummate practitioners in the art of stalking. Don Juan said that the subsequent centuries of subjugation provided for these new seers the ideal circumstances in which to perfect their skills. Oddly enough, it was the extreme rigor and coercion of that period that gave them the impetus to refine their new principles. And, owing to the fact that they never divulged their activities, they were left alone to map their findings. Were there a great many new seers during the conquest? I asked. At the beginning, there were. Near the end, there were only a handful. The rest had been exterminated. What about in our day, Don Juan? I asked. There are a few. They are scattered all over, you understand. Do you know them? I asked. Such a simple question is the hardest one to answer, he replied. There are some we know very well, but they are not exactly like us because they have concentrated on other specific aspects of knowledge, such as dancing, curing, bewitching, talking, instead of what the new seers recommend, stalking, dreaming, and intent. Those who are exactly like us would not cross our path. The seers who lived during the conquest set it up that way, so as to avoid being exterminated in the confrontation with the Spaniards. Each of those seers founded a lineage, and not all of them had descendants, so the lines are few. Do you know any who are exactly like us? I asked. A few, he replied laconically. I asked him then to give me all the information he could, for I was vitally interested in the topic. To me, it was of crucial importance to know the names and addresses for purposes of validation and corroboration. Don Juan did not seem inclined to oblige me. The new seers went through that bit of corroboration, he said. Half of them left their bones in the corroborating room, so now they are solitary birds. Let's leave it that way. All we can talk about is our line. About that, you and I can say as much as we please. He explained that all the lines of seers were started at the same time and in the same fashion. Around the end of the 16th century, every Nagual deliberately isolated himself and his group of seers from any overt contact with other seers. The consequence of that drastic segregation, he said, was the formation of the individual lineages. Our lineage consisted of 14 Naguals and 126 seers, he said. Some of those 14 Naguals had as few as 7 seers with them, others had 11, and some up to 15. He told me that his teacher, or his benefactor as he called him, was the Nagual Julian, and the one who came before Julian was the Nagual Elias. I asked him if he knew the names of all 14 Naguals. He named and enumerated them for me, so I could learn who they were. He also said that he had personally known the 15 seers who had formed his benefactor's group, and that he had also known his benefactor's teacher, the Nagual Elias, and the 11 seers of his party. Don Juan assured me that our line was quite exceptional, because it underwent a drastic change in the year 1723 as a result of an outside influence that came to bear on us and inexorably altered our course. He did not want to discuss the event itself at the moment, but he said that a new beginning is counted from that time, and that the 8 Naguals who have ruled the line since then are considered intrinsically different from the 6 who preceded them. Don Juan must have had business to take care of the next day, for I did not see him until around noon. In the meantime, 3 of his apprentices had come to town, Pablito, Nestor, and La Gorda. They were shopping for tools and materials for Pablito's carpentry business. I accompanied them and helped them to complete their errands. Then all of us went back to the boarding house. All 4 of us were sitting around talking when Don Juan came into my room. He announced that we were leaving after lunch, but that before we went to eat, he still had something to discuss with me in private. He wanted the 2 of us to take a stroll around the main square, and then all of us would meet at a restaurant. Pablito and Nestor stood up and said that they had some errands to run before meeting us. La Gorda seemed very displeased. "What are you going to talk about?" she blurted out, but quickly realized her mistake and giggled. Don Juan gave her a strange look, but did not say anything. Encouraged by his silence, La Gorda proposed that we take her along. She assured us that she would not bother us in the least. "I'm sure you won't bother us," Don Juan said to her, "but I really don't want you to hear anything of what I have to say to him." La Gorda's anger was very obvious. She blushed, and as Don Juan and I walked out of the room, her entire face clouded with anxiety and tension, becoming instantly distorted. Her mouth was open and her lips were dry. La Gorda's mood made me very apprehensive. I felt an actual discomfort. I didn't say anything, but Don Juan seemed to notice my feelings. "You should thank La Gorda day and night," he said all of a sudden. "She's helping you destroy your self-importance. She's the petty tyrant in your life, but you still haven't caught on to that." We strolled around the main plaza until all my nervousness had vanished. Then we sat down on his favorite bench again. "The ancient seers were very fortunate indeed," Don Juan began, "because they had plenty of time to learn marvelous things. Let me tell you, they knew wonders that we can't even imagine today." "Who taught them all that?" I asked. "They learned everything by themselves through seeing," he replied. "Most of the things we know in our lineage were figured out by them. The new seers corrected the mistakes of the old seers, but the basis of what we know and do is lost in Toltec time." He explained, "One of the simplest and yet most important findings from the point of view of instruction," he said, "is the knowledge that man has 2 types of awareness. The old seers called them the right and the left side of man. The old seers figured out," he went on, "that the best way to teach their knowledge was to make their apprentices shift to their left side, to a state of heightened awareness. Real learning takes place there. Very young children were given to the old seers as apprentices," Don Juan continued, "so that they wouldn't know any other way of life. Those children, in turn, when they came of age, took other children as apprentices. Imagine the things they must have uncovered in their shifts to the left and to the right, after centuries of that kind of concentration." I remarked how disconcerting those shifts were to me. He said that my experience was similar to his own. His benefactor, the Naguahulian, had created a profound schism in him by making him shift back and forth from one type of awareness to the other. He said that the clarity and freedom he experienced in heightened awareness were in total contrast to the rationalizations, the defenses, the anger, and the fear of his normal state of awareness. The old seers used this to create polarity to suit their own particular purposes. With it, they forced their apprentices to achieve the concentration needed to learn sorcery techniques. But the new seers, he said, use it to lead their apprentices to the conviction that there are unrealized possibilities in man. The best effort of the new seers, Don Juan continued, is their explanation of the mystery of awareness. They condensed it all into some concepts and actions which are taught while the apprentices are in heightened awareness. He said that the value of the new seer's method of teaching is that it takes advantage of the fact that no one can remember anything that happens while being in a state of heightened awareness. This inability to remember sets up an almost insurmountable barrier for warriors, who have to recollect all the instruction given to them if they are to go on. Only after years of struggle and discipline can warriors recollect their instruction. By then, the concepts and the procedures that were taught to them have been internalized and have thus acquired the force the new seers meant them to have. We sat down and Don Juan began his explanations. He said that seers, old and new, are divided into two categories. The first one is made up of those who are willing to exercise self-restraint and can channel their activities toward pragmatic goals, which would benefit other seers and man in general. The other category consists of those who don't care about self-restraint or about any pragmatic goals. It is the consensus among seers that the latter have failed to resolve the problem of self-importance. Self-importance is not something simple and naive, he explained. On the one hand, it is the core of everything that is good in us, and on the other hand, the core of everything that is rotten. To get rid of the self-importance that is rotten requires a masterpiece of strategy. Seers, through the ages, have given the highest praise to those who have accomplished it. I complained that the idea of eradicating self-importance, although very appealing to me at times, was really incomprehensible. I told him that I found his directives for getting rid of it so vague I could not follow them. I've said to you many times, he said, that in order to follow the path of knowledge, one has to be very imaginative. You see, in the path of knowledge, nothing is as clear as we'd like it to be. My discomfort made me argue that his admonitions about self-importance reminded me of Catholic dictums. After a lifetime of being told about the evils of sin, I had become callous. Warriors fight self-importance as a matter of strategy, not principle, he replied. Your mistake is to understand what I say in terms of morality. I see you as a highly moral man, Don Juan, I insisted. You've noticed my impeccability, that's all, he said. Impeccability, as well as getting rid of self-importance, is too vague a concept to be of any value to me, I remarked. Don Juan choked with laughter, and I challenged him to explain impeccability. Impeccability is nothing else but the proper use of energy, he said. My statements have no inkling of morality. I've saved my energy, and that makes me impeccable. To understand this, you have to save enough energy yourself. We were quiet for a long time. I wanted to think about what he had said. Suddenly, he started talking again. Warriors take strategic inventories, he said. They list everything they do. Then they decide which of those things can be changed in order to allow themselves a respite in terms of expending their energy. I argued that their list would have to include everything under the sun. He patiently answered that the strategic inventory he was talking about covered only behavioral patterns that were not essential to our survival and well-being. I jumped at the opportunity to point out that survival and well-being were categories that could be interpreted in endless ways. Hence, there was no way of agreeing what was or was not essential to survival and well-being. As I kept on talking, I began to lose momentum. Finally, I stopped because I realized the futility of my arguments. Don Juan said then that in the strategic inventories of warriors, self-importance figures as the activity that consumes the greatest amount of energy, hence their effort to eradicate it. One of the first concerns of warriors is to free that energy in order to face the unknown with it, Don Juan went on. The action of rechanneling that energy is impeccability. He said that the most effective strategy was worked out by the seers of the conquest, the unquestionable masters of stalking. It consists of 6 elements that interplay with one another. 5 of them are called the attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, timing, and will. They pertain to the world of the warrior who is fighting to lose self-importance. The 6th element, which is perhaps the most important of all, pertains to the outside world and is called the petty tyrant. He looked at me as if silently asking me whether or not I had understood. "I'm really mystified," I said. "You just keep on saying that La Gorda is the petty tyrant in my life. Just what is a petty tyrant?" "A petty tyrant is a tormentor," he replied. "Someone who either holds the power of life and death over warriors, or simply annoys them to distraction." Don Juan had made a beaming smile as he spoke to me. He said that the new seers developed their own classification of petty tyrants. Although the concept is one of their most serious and important findings, the new seers had a sense of humor about it. He assured me that there was a tinge of malicious humor in every one of their classifications, because humor was the only means of counteracting the compulsion of human awareness to take inventories and to make cumbersome classifications. The new seers, in accordance with their practice, saw fit to head their classification with the primal source of energy, the one and only ruler in the universe, and they called it simply the tyrant. The rest of the despots and authoritarians were found to be naturally infinitely below the category of tyrant. Compared to the source of everything, the most fearsome, tyrannical men are buffoons. Consequently, they were classified as petty tyrants. He said that there were 2 subclasses of minor petty tyrants. The first subclass consisted of the petty tyrants who persecute and inflict misery, but without actually causing anybody's death. They were called little petty tyrants. The second consisted of the petty tyrants who are only exasperating and bothersome to no end. They were called small fry petty tyrants, or teensy-weensy petty tyrants. I thought his classifications were ludicrous. I was sure that he was improvising the Spanish terms. I asked him if it was so. "Not at all," he replied with an amused expression. "The new seers were great ones for classifications. Genaro is doubtless one of the greatest. If you'd observe him carefully, you'd realize exactly how the new seers feel about their classifications." He laughed uproariously at my confusion when I asked him if he was pulling my leg. "I wouldn't dream of doing that," he said, smiling. "Genaro may do that, but not I, especially when I know how you feel about classifications. It's just that the new seers were terribly irreverent." He added that the little petty tyrants are further divided into 4 categories. One that torments with brutality and violence, another that does it by creating unbearable apprehension through deviousness, another which oppresses with sadness, and the last which torments by making warriors rage. "La Gorda is in a class of her own," he added. She is an acting, small-fry petty tyrant. She annoys you to pieces and makes you rage. She even slaps you. With all that, she is teaching you detachment. That's not possible, I protested. You haven't yet put together all the ingredients of the new seer's strategy, he said. Once you do that, you'll know how efficient and clever is the device of using a petty tyrant. I would certainly say that the strategy not only gets rid of self-importance, but also prepares warriors for the final realization that impeccability is the only thing that counts in the path of knowledge. He said that what the new seers had in mind was a deadly maneuver in which the petty tyrant is like a mountain peak, and the attributes of warriorship are like climbers who meet at the summit. Usually, only 4 attributes are played, he went on. The 5th, will, is always saved for an ultimate confrontation, when warriors are facing the firing squad, so to speak. Why is it done that way? Because will belongs to another sphere, the unknown. The other 4 belong to the known, exactly where the petty tyrants are lodged. In fact, what turns human beings into petty tyrants is precisely the obsessive manipulation of the known. Don Juan explained that the interplay of all 5 attributes of warriorship is done only by seers who are also impeccable warriors and have mastery over will. Such an interplay is a supreme maneuver and cannot be performed on the daily human stage. 4 attributes are all that is needed to deal with the worst of petty tyrants, he continued, provided, of course, that a petty tyrant has been found. As I said, the petty tyrant is the outside element, the one we cannot control, and the element that is perhaps the most important of them all. My benefactor used to say that the warrior who stumbles on a petty tyrant is a lucky one. He meant that you're fortunate if you come upon one in your path, because if you don't, you have to go out and look for one. He explained that one of the great accomplishments of the Seers of the Conquest was a construct he called the 3-phase progression. By understanding the nature of man, they were able to reach the incontestable conclusion that if seers can hold their own in facing petty tyrants, they can certainly face the unknown with impunity, and then they can even stand the presence of the unknowable. The average man's reaction is to think that the order of that statement should be reversed, he went on. A seer who can hold his own in the face of the unknown can certainly face petty tyrants, but that's not so. What destroyed the superb seers of ancient times was that assumption. We know better now. We know that nothing can temper the spirit of a warrior as much as the challenge of dealing with impossible people in positions of power. Only under those conditions can warriors acquire the sobriety and serenity to stand the pressure of the unknowable. I vociferously disagreed with him. I told him that in my opinion, tyrants can only render their victims helpless or make them as brutal as they themselves are. I pointed out that countless studies had been done on the effects of physical and psychological torture on such victims. The difference is in something you just said, he retorted. They are victims, not warriors. Once I felt just as you do. I'll tell you what made me change, but first, let's go back again to what I said about the conquest. The seers of that time couldn't have found a better ground. The Spaniards were the petty tyrants who tested the seers' skills to the limit. After dealing with the conquerors, the seers were capable of facing anything. They were the lucky ones. At that time, there were petty tyrants everywhere. After all those marvelous years of abundance, things changed a great deal. Petty tyrants never again had that scope. It was only during those times that their authority was unlimited. The perfect ingredient for the making of a superb seer is a petty tyrant with unlimited prerogatives. In our times, unfortunately, seers have to go to extremes to find a worthy one. Most of the time, they have to be satisfied with a very small fry. Did you find a petty tyrant yourself, Don Juan? I was lucky. A king-size one found me. At one time, though, I felt like you. I couldn't consider myself fortunate. Don Juan said that his ordeal began a few weeks before he met his benefactor. He was barely 20 years old at the time. He had gotten a job at a sugar mill, working as a laborer. He had always been very strong, so it was easy for him to get jobs that required muscle. One day, when he was moving some heavy sacks of sugar, a woman came by. She was very well dressed and seemed to be a woman of means. She was perhaps in her 50s, Don Juan said, and very domineering. She looked at Don Juan and then spoke to the foreman and left. Don Juan was then approached by the foreman, who told him that for a fee, he would recommend him for a job in the boss's house. Don Juan told the man that he had no money. The foreman smiled and said not to worry, because he would have plenty on payday. He patted Don Juan's back and assured him it was a great honor to work for the boss. Don Juan said that being a lowly, ignorant Indian living hand to mouth, not only did he believe every word, he thought a good fairy had touched him. He promised to pay the foreman anything he wished. The foreman named a large sum, which had to be paid in installments. Immediately thereafter, the foreman himself took Don Juan to the house, which was quite a distance from the town, and left him there with another foreman, a huge, somber, ugly man who asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know about Don Juan's family. Don Juan answered that he didn't have any. The man was so pleased that he even smiled through his rotten teeth. He promised Don Juan that they would pay him plenty, and that he would even be in a position to save money because he didn't have to spend any, for he was going to live and eat in the house. The way the man laughed was terrifying. Don Juan knew that he had to escape immediately. He ran for the gate, but the man cut in front of him, with a revolver in his hand. He cocked it and rammed it into Don Juan's stomach. "You are here to work to the bone," he said, "and don't you forget it." Then he shoved Don Juan around with a billy club. Then he took him to the side of the house, and after observing that he worked his men every day from sunrise to sunset without a break, he put Don Juan to work, digging out 2 enormous tree stumps. He also told Don Juan that if he ever tried to escape or went to the authorities, he would shoot him dead, and that if Don Juan should ever get away, he would swear in court that Don Juan had tried to murder the boss. "You'll work yourself here until you die," he said. "Another Indian will get your job then, just as you're taking a dead Indian's place." Don Juan said that the house looked like a fortress, with armed men with machetes everywhere. So he got busy working and tried not to think about his predicament. At the end of the day, the man came back and kicked him all the way to the kitchen, because he did not like the defiant look in Don Juan's eyes. He threatened to cut the tendons of Don Juan's arms if he didn't obey him. In the kitchen, an old woman brought food, but Don Juan was so upset and afraid that he couldn't eat. The old woman advised him to eat as much as he could. He had to be strong, she said, because his work would never end. She warned him that the man who had held his job had died just a day earlier. He was too weak to work and had fallen from a second-story window. Don Juan said that he worked at the boss's place for 3 weeks, and that the man bullied him every moment of every day. He made him work under the most dangerous conditions, doing the heaviest work imaginable, under the constant threat of his knife, gun, or billy club. He sent him daily to the stables to clean the stalls while nervous stallions were in them. At the beginning of every day, Don Juan thought that it would be his last one on earth, and surviving meant only that he had to go through the same hell again the next day. What precipitated the end was Don Juan's request to have some time off. The pretext was that he needed to go to town to pay the foreman of the sugar mill the money he owed him. The other foreman retorted that Don Juan could not stop working, not even for a minute, because he was in debt up to his ears just for the privilege of working there. Don Juan knew that he was done for. He understood the man's maneuvers. Both he and the other foreman were in cahoots to get lowly Indians from the mill, work them to death, and divide their salaries. That realization angered him so intensely that he ran through the kitchen screaming and got inside the main house. The foreman and the other workers were caught totally by surprise. He ran out the front door and almost got away, but the foreman caught up with him on the road and shot him in the chest. He left him for dead. Don Juan said that it was not his destiny to die. His benefactor found him there and tended him until he got well. When I told my benefactor the whole story, Don Juan said, he could hardly contain his excitement. That foreman is really a prize, my benefactor said. He is too good to be wasted. Someday you must go back to the house. He raved about my good luck in finding a 1 in a million petty tyrant with almost unlimited power. I thought the old man was nuts. It was years before I fully understood what he was talking about. That is one of the most horrible stories I have ever heard, I said. Did you really go back to that house? I certainly did. 3 years later. My benefactor was right. A petty tyrant like that one was 1 in a million and couldn't be wasted. How did you manage to go back? My benefactor developed a strategy using the 4 attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. Don Juan said that his benefactor, in explaining to him what he had to do to profit from facing that ogre of a man, also told him what the new seers considered to be the 4 steps on the path of knowledge. The first step is a decision to become apprentices. After the apprentices change their views about themselves and the world, they take the second step and become warriors, which is to say, beings capable of the utmost discipline and control over themselves. The third step, after acquiring forbearance and timing, is to become men of knowledge. When men of knowledge learn to see, they have taken the 4th step and have become seers. His benefactor stressed the fact that Don Juan had been on the path of knowledge long enough to have acquired a minimum of the first 2 attributes, control and discipline. Don Juan emphasized that both of these attributes refer to an inner state. A warrior is self-oriented, not in a selfish way, but in the sense of a total continuous examination of the self. At that time, I was barred from the other 2 attributes, Don Juan went on. Forbearance and timing are not quite an inner state. They are in the domain of the man of knowledge. My benefactor showed them to me through his strategy. Does this mean that you couldn't have faced the petty tyrant by yourself, I asked. I'm sure that I could have done it myself, although I have always doubted that I would have carried it off with flair and joyfulness. My benefactor was simply enjoying the encounter by directing it. The idea of using a petty tyrant is not only for perfecting the warrior spirit, but also for enjoyment and happiness. How could anyone enjoy the monster you described? He was nothing in comparison to the real monsters that the new seers faced during the conquest. By all indications, those seers enjoyed themselves blue dealing with them. They proved that even the worst tyrants can bring delight, provided, of course, that one is a warrior. Don Juan explained that the mistake average men make in confronting petty tyrants is to not have a strategy to fall back on. The fatal flaw is that average men take themselves too seriously. Their actions and feelings, as well as those of petty tyrants, are all important. Warriors, on the other hand, not only have a well-thought-out strategy, but are free from self-importance. What restrains their self-importance is that they have understood that reality is an interpretation we make. That knowledge was the definitive advantage that the new seers had over the simple-minded Spaniards. He said that he became convinced that he could defeat the foreman using only the single realization that petty tyrants take themselves with deadly seriousness, while warriors do not. Following his benefactor's strategic plan, therefore, Don Juan got a job in the same sugar mill as before. Nobody remembered that he had worked there in the past. Peons came to that sugar mill and left it without leaving a trace. His benefactor's strategy specified that Don Juan had to be solicitous of whoever came to look for another victim. As it happened, the same woman came and spotted him, as she had done years ago. This time, he was physically even stronger than before. The same routine took place. The strategy, however, called for refusing payment to the foreman from the outset. The man had never been turned down and was taken aback. He threatened to fire Don Juan from the job. Don Juan threatened him back, saying that they would go directly to the lady's house and see her. Don Juan knew that the woman, who was the wife of the owner of the mill, did not know what the two foremen were up to. He told the foreman that he knew where she lived, because he had worked in the surrounding fields cutting sugarcane. The man began to haggle, and Don Juan demanded money from him before he would accept going to the lady's house. The foreman gave in and handed him a few bills. Don Juan was perfectly aware that the foreman's acquiescence was just a ruse to get him to go to the house. "He himself once again took me to the house," Don Juan said. "It was an old hacienda owned by the people of the sugar mill. Rich men who either knew what was going on and didn't care, or were too indifferent even to notice. As soon as we got there, I ran into the house to look for the lady. I found her and dropped to my knees and kissed her hand to thank her. The two foremen were livid. The foreman at the house followed the same pattern as before, but I had the proper equipment to deal with him. I had control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. It turned out as my benefactor had planned it. My control made me fulfill the man's most asinine demands. What usually exhausts us in a situation like that is the wear and tear on our self-importance. Any man who has an iota of pride is ripped apart by being made to feel worthless. I gladly did everything he asked of me. I was joyful and strong, and I didn't give a fig about my pride or my fear. I was there as an impeccable warrior. To tune the spirit when someone is trampling on you is called control." Don Juan explained his benefactor's strategy required that instead of feeling sorry for himself as he had done before, he immediately go to work mapping the man's strong points, his weaknesses, his quirks of behavior. He found that the foreman's strongest points were his violent nature and his daring. He had shot Don Juan in broad daylight and in sight of scores of onlookers. His great weakness was that he liked his job and did not want to endanger it. Under no circumstances could he attempt to kill Don Juan inside the compound in the daytime. His other weakness was that he was a family man. He had a wife and children who lived in a shack near the house. To gather all this information while they are beating you up is called discipline, Don Juan said. The man was a regular fiend. He had no saving grace. According to the new seers, a perfect petty tyrant has no redeeming feature. Don Juan said that the other two attributes of warriorship, forbearance and timing, which he did not yet have, had been automatically included in his benefactor's strategy. Forbearance is to wait patiently, no rush, no anxiety, a simple, joyful holding back of what is due. I groveled daily, Don Juan continued, sometimes crying under the man's whip, and yet I was happy. My benefactor's strategy
was what made me go from day to day without hating the man's guts. I was a warrior. I knew that I was waiting, and I knew what I was waiting for. Right there is the great joy of warriorship.
He added that his benefactor strategy called for a systematic harassment of the man by taking cover with a higher order, just as the new seers of the new cycle had done during the conquest by shielding themselves with the Catholic Church. A lowly priest was sometimes more powerful than a nobleman. Don Juan's shield was the lady who got him the job. He kneeled in front of her and called her a saint every time he saw her. He begged her to give him the medallion of her patron saint so he could pray to him for her health and well-being.
She gave me one, Don Juan went on, and that rattled the foreman to pieces. And when I got the servants to pray at night, he nearly had a heart attack. I think he decided then to kill me. He couldn't afford to let me go on. As a countermeasure, I organized a rosary among all the servants of the house. The lady thought I had the makings of a most pious man. I didn't sleep soundly after that, nor did I sleep in my bed. I climbed to the roof every night. From there, I saw the man looking twice for me in the middle of the night with murder in his eyes. Daily, he shoved me into the stallion's stalls, hoping that I would be crushed to death. But I had a plank of heavy boards that I braced against one of the corners and protected myself behind it. The man never knew because he was nauseated by the horses. Another of his weaknesses, the deadliest of all as things turned out.
Don Juan said that timing is the quality that governs the release of all that is held back. Control, discipline, forbearance are like a dam behind which everything is pooled. Timing is the gate in the dam. The man knew only violence, with which he terrorized. If his violence was neutralized, he was rendered nearly helpless. Don Juan knew that the man would not dare kill him in view of the house. So one day, in the presence of the other workers, but in sight of his lady as well, Don Juan insulted the man. He called him a coward, who was mortally afraid of the boss's wife. His benefactor's strategy had called for being on the alert for a moment like that, and using it to turn the tables on the petty tyrant. Unexpected things always happen that way. The lowest of the slaves suddenly makes fun of the tyrant, taunts him, makes him feel ridiculous in front of the significant witnesses, and then rushes away without giving the tyrant time to retaliate.
A moment later, the man went crazy with rage, but I was already solicitously kneeling in front of the lady.
He continued. Don Juan said that when the lady went inside the house, the man and his friends called him to the back, allegedly to do some work. The man was very pale, white with anger. From the sound of his voice, Don Juan knew what the man was really planning to do. Don Juan pretended to acquiesce, but instead of heading for the back, he ran for the stables. He trusted that the horses would make such a racket that the owners would come out to see what was wrong. He knew that the man would not dare shoot him. That would have been too noisy, and the man's fear of endangering his job was too overpowering. Don Juan also knew that the man would not go where the horses were. That is, unless he had been pushed beyond his endurance.
I jumped inside the stall of the wildest stallion, Don Juan said, and the petty tyrant, blinded by rage, took out his knife and jumped in after me. I went instantly behind my planks. The horse kicked him once, and it was all over. I had spent 6 months in that house, and in that period of time, I had exercised the 4 attributes of warriorship. Thanks to them, I had succeeded. Not once had I felt sorry for myself or wept in impotence. I had been joyful and serene. My control and discipline were as keen as they'd ever been, and I had had a first-hand view of what forbearance and timing did for impeccable warriors. And I had not once wished the man to die. My benefactor explained something very interesting. Forbearance means holding back with the spirit, something that the warrior knows is rightfully due. It doesn't mean that a warrior goes around plotting to do anybody mischief, or planning to settle past scores. Forbearance is something independent. As long as the warrior has control, discipline, and timing, forbearance assures giving whatever is due to whoever deserves it.
Do petty tyrants sometimes win and destroy the warrior facing them? I asked.
Of course. There was a time when warriors died like flies at the beginning of the conquest. The ranks were decimated. The petty tyrants could put anyone to death, simply acting on a whim. Under that kind of pressure, seers reached sublime states.
Don Juan said that was the time when the surviving seers had to exert themselves to the limit to find new ways.
The new seers used petty tyrants,
Don Juan said, staring at me fixedly.
Not only to get rid of their self-importance, but to accomplish the very sophisticated maneuver of moving themselves out of this world. You'll understand that maneuver as we keep on discussing the mastery of awareness.
I had explained to Don Juan that what I had wanted to know was whether in the present, in our times, the petty tyrants he had called small fry could ever defeat a warrior.
All the time,
he replied.
The consequences aren't as dire as those in the remote past. Today, it goes without saying that warriors always have a chance to recuperate or to retrieve and come back later. But there is another side to this problem. To be defeated by a small fry petty tyrant is not deadly, but devastating. The degree of mortality, in a figurative sense, is almost as high. By that I mean that warriors who succumb to small fry petty tyrants are obliterated by their own sense of failure and unworthiness. That spells high mortality to me.
How do you measure defeat?
Anyone who joins the petty tyrant is defeated. To act in anger, without control and discipline, to have no forbearance, is to be defeated.
What happens after warriors are defeated?
They either regroup themselves, or they abandon the quest for knowledge and join the ranks of the petty tyrants for life.
End of passage.
I'm not trying to be difficult, Don Juan, but believe me, everything that has happened to me meets those qualifications, I said, knowing that I was lying. I wanted to apologize, but Don Juan didn't pay attention to me. It was as if I hadn't said a thing. Don't think about this album in terms of banalities or in terms of a trivial rehashing of your life experiences, he said. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to quiet my mind. I was talking to myself frantically about my insoluble problem. I most certainly didn't like to visit Don Juan at all. In his presence, I felt threatened. He verbally accosted me and didn't leave me any room whatsoever to show my worth. I detested losing face every time I opened my mouth. I detested being the fool. But there was another voice inside me, a voice that came from a greater depth, more distant, almost faint. In the midst of my barrages of known dialogue, I heard myself saying that it was too late for me to turn back. But it wasn't really my voice or my thoughts that I was experiencing. It was rather like an unknown voice that said I was too far gone into Don Juan's world, and that I needed him more than I needed air. Say whatever you wish, the voice seemed to say to me, but if you were not the egomaniac that you are, you wouldn't be so chagrined. That's the voice of your daily mind, Don Juan said, just as if he'd been listening to or reading my thoughts. My body jumped involuntarily. My fright was so intense that tears came to my eyes. I confessed to Don Juan the whole nature of my turmoil. Your conflict is a very natural one, he said, and believe you me, I don't exacerbate it that much. I'm not the type. I have some stories to tell you about what my teacher, the Nahual Julian, used to do to me. I detested him with my entire being. I was very young, and I saw how women adored him, gave themselves to him like nothing. and when I tried to say hello to them, they would turn against me like lionesses, ready to bite my head off. They hated my guts and loved him. How do you think I felt? How do you resolve this conflict, Don Juan? I asked with more than genuine interest. I didn't resolve anything, he declared. It, the conflict or whatever, was the result of the battle between my two minds. Every one of us human beings has two minds. One is totally ours, and it is like a faint voice that always brings us order, directness, purpose. The other mind brings us conflict, self-assertion, doubts, hopelessness. My fixation on my own mental concatenations was so intense that I completely missed what Don Juan had said. I could clearly remember every one of his words, but they had no meaning for me. Don Juan looked directly into my eyes and very calmly repeated what he had just said. I was still incapable of grasping what he meant. For some strange reason, Don Juan, I can't concentrate on what you're telling me, I said. I understand perfectly why you can't, he said, smiling expansively, and so will you someday, at the same time that you resolve the conflict of whether you like me or not. The day you cease to be the me center of the world. In the meantime, he continued, let's go back to the idea of preparing your album of memorable events. I should add that such an album is an exercise in discipline and impartiality. Consider this album to be an act of war. Don Juan's assertion that my conflict of both liking and not liking to see him was going to end whenever I abandoned my egocentrism was no solution for me. In fact, that assertion made me angrier. It frustrated me all the more. And when I heard Don Juan speak of the album as an act of war, I lashed out at him with all my poison. The idea that this is a collection of events is already hard to understand, I said in a tone of protest. But that on top of all this you call it an album, and say that such an album as an act of war is too much for me. It's too obscure. Being obscure makes the metaphor lose its meaning. How strange, it's the opposite for me, Don Juan replied calmly. Such an album being an act of war has all the meaning in the world for me. I wouldn't like my album of memorable events to be anything but an act of war. I wanted to argue my point further and explain to him that I did understand the idea of an album of memorable events. I objected to the perplexing way he was describing it. I thought of myself in those days as an advocate of clarity and functionalism in the use of language. Don Juan didn't comment on my belligerent mood. He only shook his head as if he were fully agreeing with me. After a while, I either completely ran out of energy or I got a gigantic surge of it. All of a sudden, without any effort on my part, I realized the futility of my outbursts. I felt embarrassed, no end. What possesses me to act the way I do? I asked Don Juan in earnest. I was at that instant utterly baffled. I was so shaken by my realization that without any volition on my part, I began to weep. Don't worry about stupid details, Don Juan said reassuringly. Every one of us, male and female, is like this. To resolve this conflict is a matter of intending it, he said. Shamans beckon intent by voicing the word intent, loud and clear. Intent is a force that exists in the universe. When shamans beckon intent, it comes to them and sets up the path for attainment, which means that shamans always accomplish what they set out to do. Do you mean, Don Juan, that shamans get anything they want, even if it is something petty and arbitrary, I asked. No, I didn't mean that. Intent can be called, of course, for anything, he replied. But shamans have found out, the hard way, that intent comes to them only for something that is abstract. That's the safety valve for shamans. Otherwise, they would be unbearable. In your case, beckoning intent to resolve the conflict of your two minds, or to hear the voice of your true mind, is not a petty, trivial, or arbitrary matter. Quite the contrary, it is ethereal and abstract, and yet as vital to you as anything can be. Don Juan paused for a moment, then he began to talk again about the album. My own album, being an act of war, demanded a super careful selection, he said. It is now a precise collection of the unforgettable moments of my life, and everything that led me to them. I have concentrated in it what has been and will be meaningful to me. In my opinion, a warrior's album is something most concrete, something so to the point that it is shattering. I had no clue as to what Don Juan wanted, and yet I did understand him to perfection. He advised me to sit down, alone, and let my thoughts, memories, and ideas come to me freely. He recommended that I make an effort to let the voice from the depths of me speak out and tell me what to select. Don Juan told me then to go inside the house and lie down on a bed that I had there. It was made out of wooden boxes and dozens of empty burlap sacks that served as a mattress. My whole body ached, and when I lay down on the bed, it was actually extremely comfortable. I took his suggestions to heart and began to think about my past, looking for events that had left a mark on me. I soon realized that my assertion that every event in my life had been meaningful was nonsense. As I pressed myself to recollect, I found that I didn't even know where to start. Through my mind ran endless disassociated thoughts and memories of events that I had experienced, but I couldn't decide whether or not they had had any meaning for me. The impression I got was that nothing had had any significance whatsoever. It looked as if I had gone through life like a corpse, empowered to walk and talk but not to feel anything. Having no concentration whatsoever to pursue the subject beyond a shallow attempt, I gave up and fell asleep. "Did you have any success?" Don Juan asked me when I woke up hours later. Instead of being at ease after sleeping and resting, I was again moody and belligerent. "No, I didn't have any success," I barked. "Did you hear that voice from the depths of you?" he asked. "I think I did," I lied. "What did it say to you?" he inquired in an urgent tone. "I can't think of it, Don Juan," I muttered. "Ah, you are back in your daily mind," he said, and patted me forcefully on the back. "Your daily mind has taken over again. Let's relax it by talking about your collection of memorable events. I should tell you that the selection of what to put in your album is not an easy matter. This is the reason I say that making this album is an act of war. You have to remake yourself 10 times over in order to know what to select." I clearly understood then, if only for a second, that I had another way of perceiving, different from my daily perception. However, the thought was so vague that I lost it instantly. What remained was just the sensation of an incapacity to fulfill Don Juan's requirement. Instead of graciously accepting my incapacity, though, I allowed it to become a threatening affair. The driving force of my life in those days was to appear always in a good light. To be incompetent was the equivalent of being a loser, something that was thoroughly intolerable to me. Since I didn't know how to respond to the challenge Don Juan was posing, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I got angry. "I've got to think a great deal more about this, Don Juan," I said. "I've got to give my mind some time to settle on the idea." Of course, Don Juan assured me. "Take all the time in the world. But hurry." Nothing else was said about the subject at that time. At home, I forgot about it completely until one day when, quite abruptly, in the middle of a lecture I was attending, the imperious command to search for the memorable events of my life hit me like a bodily jolt, a nervous spasm that shook my entire body from head to toe.
He told me then that I was in my keenest state of awareness, and that it was possible for me to intend my assemblage point to shift deeper into my left side to a dreaming position. He said that warriors should never attempt seeing unless they are aided by dreaming. I argued that to fall asleep in public was not one of my fortes. He clarified his statement, saying that to move the assemblage point away from its natural setting and to keep it fixed at a new location is to be asleep. With practice, seers learn to be asleep and yet behave as if nothing is happening to them. After a moment's pause, he added that for purposes of seeing the cocoon of man, one has to gaze at people from behind as they walk away. It is useless to gaze at people face to face, because the front of the egg-like cocoon of man has a protective shield, which seers call the front plate. It is an almost impregnable, unyielding shield that protects us throughout our lives against the onslaught of a peculiar force that stems from the emanations themselves. He also told me not to be surprised if my body was stiff, as though it were frozen. He said that I was going to feel very much like someone standing in the middle of a room, looking at the street through a window, and that speed was of the essence, as people were going to move extremely fast by my seeing window. He told me then to relax my muscles, shut off my internal dialogue, and let my assemblage point drift away under the spell of inner silence. He urged me to smack myself gently but firmly on my right side, between my hip bone and my rib cage. I did that 3 times, and I was sound asleep. It was a most peculiar state of sleep. My body was dormant, but I was perfectly aware of everything that was taking place. I could hear Don Juan talking to me, and I could follow every one of his statements as if I were awake, yet I could not move my body at all. Don Juan said that a man was going to walk by my seeing window, and that I should try to see him. I unsuccessfully attempted to move my head, and then a shiny, egg-like object appeared. It was resplendent. I was awed by the sight, and before I could recover from my surprise, it was gone. It floated away, bobbing up and down. Everything had been so sudden and fast that it made me feel frustrated and impatient. I felt that I was beginning to wake up. Don Juan talked to me again and urged me to relax. He said that I had no right and no time to be impatient. Suddenly, another luminous being appeared and moved away. It seemed to be made of white fluorescent shag. Don Juan whispered in my ear that if I wanted to, my eyes were capable of slowing down everything they focused on. Then he warned me that another man was coming. I realized at that instant that there were 2 voices. The one I had just heard was the same one that had admonished me to be patient. That was Don Juan's. The other, the one that told me to use my eyes to slow down movement, was the voice of seeing. That afternoon, I saw 10 luminous beings in slow motion. The voice of seeing guided me to witness in them everything Don Juan had told me about the glow of awareness. There was a vertical band with a stronger amber glow on the right side of those egg-like luminous creatures, perhaps 1/10 of the total volume of the cocoon. The voice said that that was the man's band of awareness. The voice pointed out a dot on the man's band, a dot with an intense shine. It was high on the oblong shapes, almost on the crest of them, on the surface of the cocoon. The voice said that it was the assemblage point. When I saw each luminous creature in profile, from the point of view of its body, its egg-like shape was like a gigantic, asymmetrical yo-yo that was standing edgewise, or like an almost round pot that was resting on its side with its lid on. The part that looked like a lid was the front plate. It was perhaps 1/5 of the thickness of the total cocoon. I would have gone on seeing those creatures, but Don Juan said that I should now gaze at people face to face and sustain my gaze until I had broken the barrier and I was seeing the emanations. I followed his command. Almost instantaneously, I saw a most brilliant array of live, compelling fibers of light. It was a dazzling sight that immediately shattered my balance. I fell down on the cement walk on my side. From there, I saw the compelling fibers of light multiply themselves. They burst open, and myriads of other fibers came out of them. But the fibers, compelling as they were, somehow did not interfere with my ordinary view. There were scores of people going into church. I was no longer seeing them. There were quite a few women and men just around the bench. I wanted to focus my eyes on them, but instead, I noticed how one of those fibers of light bulged suddenly. It became like a ball of fire that was perhaps 7 feet in diameter. It rolled on me. My first impulse was to roll out of its way. Before I could even move a muscle, the ball had hit me. I felt it as clearly as if someone had punched me gently in the stomach. An instant later, another ball of fire hit me, this time with considerably more strength. And then Don Juan whacked me really hard on the cheek with his open hand. I jumped up involuntarily and lost sight of the fibers of light and the balloons that were hitting me. Don Juan said that I had successfully endured my first brief encounter with the eagle's emanations, but that a couple of shoves from the tumbler had dangerously opened my gap. He added that the balls that had hit me were called the rolling force, or the tumbler. We had returned to his house, although I did not remember how or when. I had spent hours in a sort of semi-sleeping state. Don Juan and the others of his group had given me large amounts of water to drink. They had also submerged me in an ice-cold tub of water for short periods of time. Were those fibers I saw the eagle's emanations? I asked Don Juan.
Yes, but you didn't really see them, he replied. No sooner had you begun to see than the tumbler stopped you. If you had remained a moment longer, it would have blasted you.
What exactly is the tumbler? I asked.
It is a force from the eagle's emanations, he said. A ceaseless force that strikes us every instant of our lives. It is lethal when seen, but otherwise we are oblivious to it in our ordinary lives because we have protective shields. We have consuming interests that engage all of our awareness. We are permanently worried about our station, our positions. These shields, however, do not keep the tumbler away. They simply keep us from seeing it directly, protecting us in this way from getting hurt by the fright of seeing the balls of fire hitting us. Shields are a great help and a great hindrance to us. They pacify us and at the same time fool us. They give us a false sense of security. He warned me that a moment would come in my life when I would be without any shields, uninterruptedly at the mercy of the tumbler. He said that it is an obligatory stage in the life of a warrior, known as losing the human form. I asked him to explain to me once and for all what the human form is and what it means to lose it. He replied that seers describe the human form as the compelling force of alignment of the emanations lit by the glow of awareness on the precise spot on which normally man's assemblage point is fixated. It is the force that makes us into persons. Thus, to be a person is to be compelled to affiliate with that force of alignment, and consequently to be affiliated with the precise spot where it originates. By reason of their activities, at a given moment, the assemblage points of warriors drift toward the left. It is a permanent move which results in an uncommon sense of aloofness or control, or even abandon. That drift of the assemblage point entails a new alignment of emanations. It is the beginning of a series of greater shifts. Seers very aptly call this initial shift losing the human form, because it marks an inexorable movement of the assemblage point away from its original setting, resulting in the irreversible loss of our affiliation to the force that makes us persons. End of passage.
Stopping the World. 1. Reaffirmations from the world around us. I understand you know a great deal about plants, sir, I said to the old Indian in front of me. A friend of mine had just put us in contact and left the room, and we had introduced ourselves to each other. The old man had told me that his name was Juan Matus. Did your friend tell you that? He asked casually. Yes, he did. I pick plants. Or rather, they let me pick them, he said softly. We were in the waiting room of a bus depot in Arizona. I asked him in very formal Spanish if he would allow me to question him. I said, Would the gentleman, caballero, permit me to ask some questions? Caballero, which is derived from the word caballo, or horse, originally meant horseman, or a nobleman on horseback. He looked at me inquisitively. "I'm a horseman without a horse," he said with a big smile. And then he added, "I've told you that my name is Juan Matus."